This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. There's a little-known group tasked with developing a master plan for the preservation and restoration of Connecticut's state capitol building. The Preservation and Restoration Commission is expected to meet Tuesday to decide on a recommendation over one of the marble statues that adorn the outside of the Capitol. History buffs may know John Mason, a founder of the Connecticut colony, but he's also a colonist that in 1637 led a massacre, killing hundreds of Pequot people. It's that history that has led to suggestions his statue be removed. Today, Where We Live, we bring different perspectives on this question. Coming up, we hear from Connecticut state historian Walt Woodward. You can join us too. Statues from the 19th and 20th centuries, do they serve a purpose today? No matter the answer, what are we all doing to learn more about the context behind these historical figures? You can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Joining our conversation first is Rodney Butler, chairman of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation. Chairman Butler, welcome back to the show.
Good morning, and thank you, Lucy, for having me back. I appreciate the time today.
Now, you submitted video comments at this November commission hearing asking that the statue be moved to the old State House where it might be better understood. A part of your comments were, quote, "I'm not here to erase that history, but to help put it into a more comprehensive context." What do you mean, Chairman Butler, and how would moving this statue help change the context?
Well, again, thank you, Lucy. Great question. From our perspective, the Mason statue on the Capitol facade is intended to glorify Mason's actions rather than to provide an education on what took place, right? In fact, I've been to the Capitol many times, and you can check my testimony over the years, where I've actually spoken on exactly that as I walk in the building, it's offensive to see this bust of a man who slaughtered so many Pequot ancestors. And the look of surprise on the legislators' face that they didn't even know he was on there. It just tells you how important he is in the mind from their perspective. But, when you think about Mason himself, one only has to consider the proximity of Mason's statue to the stone engraving that's also on the facade of the Pequot massacre on the building, and to understand what is being celebrated. I think, and from a broader context, listening back on the hearing, and unfortunately I wasn't able to be there, I had to do a video message. But I thought Dr. Mancini's point about Connecticut's role in Indian policy was probably the most important point that most didn't pick up on. And he noted that Connecticut is literally ground zero for Indian affairs and the policy in this nation, right? I mean, you look at the total warfare, cultural genocide, the creation of reservations and other forms of land disposition, enslavement, and racism. It's deeply rooted in the Connecticut story. And yet he said these lived experiences remain abstractions for most of our residents. And I would contend that Mason's statue on the Capitol building celebrates Connecticut's role in that history.
So let's dig into that more, Chairman Butler. I mentioned this massacre on a Pequot village in Mystic in 1637, also known as the Pequot War. You had mentioned some lawmakers surprised that John Mason is even adorning the state capitol. But I guess it shouldn't come as a surprise that many people in our state don't know a lot about that history of the Pequot War. So tell us briefly what happened that day.
Well, I mean, it's complex, right? I mean, there's first of all, I'd send anyone to the Pequot Battlefields website that we worked on with many historians, including Dr. Woodward, in building the timeline of what led up to the Pequot War. But I mean, in short, when colonialism in itself was, the colonists moving into the lands of our ancestors, our native ancestors, all throughout through New England, and to say that moving to a new land, at least new to them, and taking property from inhabitants who have lived there for millennium is okay, and that they shouldn't be upset about it, I think is a false narrative. And so, when you think about the time frame and what was occurring, and the self-preservation mode that my ancestors and many tribes throughout New England and eventually across the country were in, that was the context of the Pequot War. And leading up to the Pequot Massacre, which happened on May 21st, 1637, that early that morning, Mason and his troops along with some of the Mohegan and my Narragansett relatives, attacked a dormant fort where men, women, and children were sleeping at that time, and slaughtered, several hundred of them in a single morning. And so, and fascinating to think about it in the sense that, and Chief Malerba had spoke on it from the Mohegans' perspective during the hearing, that even for us, we had conflict as natives back then, right? But that type of warfare was new to us, a complete slaughter and annihilation. It wasn't even acceptable to the Mohegans and Narragansett who had joined John Mason at the time, and they turned away in sorrow, and that's that point of history that turned not only for us but for tribes throughout the region and throughout the country at large.
And so you, again, support the removal of John Mason because of the fact that he led this massacre in 1637. His descendant also spoke at that hearing saying that, you can't judge a man by that one particular incident. And he was a founding father of the Connecticut colony. And so when we think about removing the statue and putting it in the old State House, what do you want to see happen then, Chairman?
Well, it's certainly not about simply removing and erasing history. I mean, that's not the point here. I think, I have tremendous respect for Dr. Woodward and quite frankly, his amazing partnership with us over the years in my nation and sharing our history. But one of the things that he had mentioned during his testimony was adding, some Native leaders to the building as well to try to balance it out. And I think that misses the point, right? The point here is that the statue itself is glorifying atrocities committed that we find so offensive, particularly given that that's represented on the state Capitol building. I think what we're trying to accomplish is not just simply removing and acting like it didn't exist. It happened, right? We know it happened. And what we're saying is similar to what you're seeing in the town of Windsor, which, by the way, is known for Mason and founding it. The Windsor Historical Society is saying we need to move the statue that they have there, which originally came from Mystic, by the way, that sat on the grounds or close to the grounds of the original massacre, to speak about offensive. We need to put it in context in a way that we can actually, speak about it from a balanced perspective of, what happened in history and his role in it and who he was as a person. And so, again, we're not trying to erase history. We're simply saying, let's not celebrate it, but let's move to the State House so we can have an open conversation and talk about the history of this man who probably did some good things within the state. But, in the context of the massacre, I mean, that's a big moment in our history as a state, and a defining one for him as an individual that I'm not sure the residents of the state truly want to celebrate.
You're hearing Chairman of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation, Rodney Butler, as we talk about this upcoming vote from the State Preservation and Restoration Commission. They're going to vote on its recommendation over this marble statue of John Mason that adorns the outside of the Capitol. We're going to be hearing from our state historian, Walt Woodward, coming up. But again, Chairman Butler, you spoke at this hearing. I should mention that members of the Eastern Pequot Tribal Nation also submitted comment supporting the removal of the Mason statue. I'm just wondering what response you got after that hearing, not only from people among your tribe, but from other residents when they think about the context, because again, the context is something that a lot of people are not familiar with.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Lisa. And I think that lack of context allows a statue like that to reside on the Capitol and nobody think twice about it. But what I've seen from the follow-up conversation that has ensued is it really has opened up dialogue about education. And I always tie this to the importance. We had so many great pieces of legislation passed this year from the Pequot perspective within the state legislature. But I'll say none more important than the Native Curriculum Initiative. Because without that foundation of education of who we are and the true beginnings and roots of Connecticut, the state that's an Algonquin word for the Long Tidal River, that is the foundation of the relationship that we'll have as Native people and the citizens of the state of Connecticut moving forward. And that's important. It's all about education. And truly believe that will change the relationship that we have for generations to come.
Earlier, you mentioned Jason Mancini, who's with Connecticut Humanities, that also submitted testimony, spoke at that commission hearing. When we think about that moment in 1637, that massacre of men, women, and children in Mystic, almost led to the extinction of the Pequot people. And you had referenced that this was then a model for how white settlers would go on to nearly eradicate North Americans.
Yeah, no, it happened over and over and over. When you think about the end of the Pequot War, it was sealed with the Treaty of Hartford, which there were many components to the Treaty of Hartford, but one of them in 1638 was specific to the Pequot, and saying that, the Pequot, and summarizing, the Pequot essentially no longer existed. We couldn't speak our language. We were divided up as slaves. Over, amongst the colony, the neighboring tribes, and sent into the Caribbean slave trade as well. And you mentioned my cousins, the Eastern Pequot, and just a quick point of history here: the Eastern Pequot were actually the remaining Pequots from the Pequot War who were sent to be slave to the Narragansett. And the Western Pequot, which is Mashantucket Pequot, were actually placed amongst the Mohegan. And again, I note that even for us as Native people at the time, it was so foreign, that type of warfare, and the assumption of slaves and the like, that both the Mohegan and Narragansett eventually released the Pequot captives from both tribes. And we settled in and eventually had reservations, which you think about the conflict itself, right? The initial reservation system that we had and we still reside on since 1666 here in Mashantucket. And that model just played out for the following centuries.
Again, this commission hearing is tomorrow. They'll vote on its recommendation, and then it goes to the Office of Legislative Management, which controls the 14-acre Capitol campus, about whether to remove and relocate the statue. No matter the outcome of the vote, how will you keep talking about the Pequot War and the importance of learning this history, Chairman Butler?
Well, again, I go back to the Native American curriculum. I think that's the key component moving forward. I mean, these are symbols and simple reminders of how far we haven't come as a state and as a nation with coming to terms with our history and how to move forward. And so that curriculum is key. I mean, there's the mascot bill as well that was passed and addresses the high school mascots and the funding tied to whether you keep your native mascot or not. But ultimately, as we continue to move forward with this administration and the State Department of Education, and we roll out a basic curriculum that allows the entire state of Connecticut to fully understand and embrace our history as a state, that's really the ultimate goal moving forward. It's not about simply taking down statues and placing them in a more historical context. It's just a part of the much, much broader discussion that's required.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Rodney Butler, again, is the chairman of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation. Thank you for your time today.
Absolutely, Lucy. Thank you. I appreciate it.
After the break, we'll hear from Connecticut State Historian Walt Woodward. Tomorrow, a special commission, again, will vote on its recommendation over whether to remove the John Mason statue from the state capitol. What's your take? In recent years, discussions around the country have led to the removal of Confederate statues and statues of Christopher Columbus. Some have even been removed in our state. Have these discussions helped Americans learn more about our history? You can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Should the statue of John Mason, a founder of the Connecticut colony, be removed from the state capitol? That's the question before a special commission weighing public input in the context of Mason's role leading a massacre of Pequot people in 1637. Hearst, Connecticut's Ken Dixon reported the projected cost to remove the 3,000-pound Mason statue is in excess of $50,000. It's expected on Tuesday the State Capitol Preservation and Restoration Commission will make a recommendation on whether to remove and relocate the Mason statue. State Senator and Commission member Kathy Austin tells us there's a $5 million budget for updates to the state capitol building. Now, joining us now on Zoom is state historian Walt Woodward, who's also associate professor of history at the University of Connecticut. Walt, welcome back.
Good morning, Lucy. How are you?
I'm doing well. You also spoke at that commission hearing, and you touched on one alternative for keeping the Mason statue outside the Capitol, but also filling in these empty niches. So can you tell us more about your proposal?
Well, what I would like to see, and I understand Chairman Butler's position on elevating Native leaders to the Capitol, but I think there's a real opportunity here. You know, the people who designed the Capitol in the late 19th century meant for it to be a living history book, for the statuary on the Capitol to tell the story of Connecticut's history. And for them, of course, it was a triumphalist story of great Connecticut people who looked like them. These people were largely the white Anglo descendants of the Puritan founders. And so that was their model. But I think what's happened in the centuries since then is that we've really developed a new understanding of how history works. It's not a story of saints and sinners and perfect people. There are people with flaws and faults, and any effort to tell the story of Connecticut as a story of great men and women is ultimately, I think, doomed to fail, because we move forward in history, if we move forward at all, cautiously and slowly and through failures and successes. I think the history should reflect that. I think the history on the building should reflect the reality of our history, which even in the case of the Pequot War was far more complex than a good guy, bad guy story of terrible John Mason and totally innocent opponents. It was, even as Chairman Butler pointed out, this was a time of great conflict between indigenous people and the English settlers. It wasn't just a story of colonization. The English people brought into Connecticut were invited by the Sequans because they had been, the Sequan was a tribe up at Hartford, and they were trying to resist aggression by the Pequots, who had been on a kind of colonizing effort through the 17th century. This history is really complex, and the great opportunity for us is to use it to talk about questions of justice and redress and race and erasure. And we still have, I think, many places on the Capitol where this story in all its complexity can be told.
This particular John Mason statue erected, I believe, in 1909. So it's been up there for some time. Statues certainly are not something we need to learn history, Walt. And so when we think about contextualizing this with your proposal, so to keep the statue where it is, but how do we do a better job as a state to learn about this particular moment in 1637?
Well, I think Chairman Butler is right. Having an indigenous curriculum in the Connecticut school system is a tremendously important first step. But I think, you know, if the John Mason statue is moved into a museum, the unfortunate truth of museums, and they are trying very hard to become much more inclusive and diverse, but museums are today largely places where middle-aged white women largely are the primary attendees. They are not places where people go to really engage critical issues most of the time. Unfortunately, although there are places that do that, I can't think of a better place to tell these stories than at the state capitol, where the where the real work of the state is done every day, and not just to museum visitors, but to the people engaged in creating the future. And the way you do that is through careful signage, through having spaces in the Capitol where you can engage and talk about and use these stories to reflect not only on the past, but on the issues we face in the present. The Capitol was intended to be a place of learning and a model to learn about the state's history. I'm just proposing that we rethink what that history lesson should be and still use it for that.
You're hearing state historian Walt Woodward here on Where We Live. So up until this point, Walt, have these stories and discussions been shared at the Capitol? I know school groups go to the Capitol, at least before the pandemic. And so has there been an absence of teaching this history?
Well, the League of Women Voters, who I believe is the one who, the group that supervises the tours of the Capitol, I think over the years they have used that to tell the Capitol story pretty well. But there's certainly, we've actually at the Capitol been engaged throughout the 21st century and even before that in a kind of rethinking of what the statuary means. We have, Prudence Crandall is now, her statue is in the state Capitol as part of this rethinking story. And we could have done a better job, I think, if we really accepted the fact that this is not the place where Connecticut's great and glorious, the stories of the saints are told, but where the stories of frail people who were good and bad, but who helped the state move forward, or maybe not, are told.
Zooming out from the John Mason statue question, if it should remain or be moved, other founding fathers adorn the state capitol. And when we look into their history, Walt, also complicated.
Well, there are slave owners up there. There are, the statuary on the Capitol is there because there was a kind of selective remembering of history that went into the selection of most of the people who are up there. I would argue that in some ways, removing statues or replacing them, if it's done with a similar selective choice of what parts of history we want to remember, is not going to be successful, and it's not going to be as useful as it could be. One of the people who is up there near John Mason is John Winthrop Jr., who was one of the early governors of Connecticut. He was, I think, instrumental in helping end witchcraft executions in Connecticut. He also was instrumental in supporting the Pequots in their efforts to come back after the Pequot War, after the Treaty of Hartford had said, the Pequots can no longer exist as a people. He was instrumental in defending their right to regather. That's a story that's not told very often. It's absolutely true. And we could tell that about him. And yet Winthrop was also, we know that he was an enslaver. So how do we handle these mix of traits of people? They just don't fit our modern wish to have good guys and bad guys only. It doesn't work.
Before, when you were on the show, we talked about how you're going to be retiring and there's a search for a new state historian, Walt. This sounds like the perfect opportunity for that new historian to pick up wherever this chapter closes, depending on what happens with the statue. What do you want to see in the next year or two when we think about our history and the difficult conversations that need to be had?
I would be so thrilled if my successor came in and played a role in a much larger discussion of how we are going to use history at the state capitol, but expanding out from that in our schools and as a culture and society. History is the way we look at the past to instruct how we think and act moving forward. But it's often, this is a great opportunity to think about history and its value in a different way, to think about how culture and values change over time and what that might mean both for the present and for the future. My fear is that taking statues away ultimately produces a kind of amnesia. We let Mason be the scapegoat for 3 centuries of abuse and mistreatment of indigenous people, that, Mason's gone, so we don't have to think about that anymore. That would be a terrible loss.
Walt Woodward, again, is Connecticut's state historian. We thank you for your time today, Walt.
Thank you, Lucy.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. Coming up after the break, we hear my recent conversation with U.S. Education Secretary Miguel Cardona, Connecticut's former education commissioner. We talk about the COVID surge, recent school threats, and student loan debt, among other topics. First, it's the first day of Connecticut Public Radio's end-of-the-year fundraising campaign. Each day, Where We Live brings you live conversations with Connecticut residents about a variety of issues. Please support the context you hear each day with a pledge. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Joining us now is U.S. Education Secretary Dr. Miguel Cardona, Connecticut's former Education Commissioner. Secretary Cardona, welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you.
Now, we last spoke in January before your Senate confirmation, so you've been on the job for, 9 months? What has stood out to you so far in your new position?
Just the amazing opportunity we have and the commitment of our educators, of our parents, of our students to reopen schools and be together. And people wanted to be together again, and they are. And I've been fortunate to have a bird's eye view of the joy that our students are feeling to be back in the classrooms with their friends, with their teachers. And I'm not going to say back to normal because, we're still using mitigation strategies. Things are not the same. But they're back together, and I think that's really important to celebrate.
So much has changed, just thinking about it in the last few weeks, the fact that 5 to 11-year-olds are now able to access the COVID vaccine. But I also wanted to talk to you about school climate and safety. There was that school shooting in Oxford, Michigan, the deadliest school shooting since 2018. And there have been multiple school closings recently in Connecticut and in other states after threats, some of those threats coming in on social media. So, Secretary Cardona, what can the federal government do to help school districts? And when I think about that, the students, the staff who have been facing multiple disruptions and trauma.
I remember my last year serving as principal of a school in Meriden. Was when the tragedy at Sandy Hook happened, and that was too close. You felt hopeless when that took place, and I remember having conversations with those brave parents who turned that tragedy into a cause. I'm inspired by them, and I know the conversation continues across the country on how best to address that from a political perspective. But what I can tell you is that in our schools, we are really moving toward understanding the importance of a balanced educational program that includes social and emotional well-being at the core of it, that includes improved access to mental health supports for our students who need it. We're experiencing a pandemic together. Many of our students are coming in with trauma from the pandemic. We must really double down on our efforts to provide mental health supports for our students and access to social and emotional learning so that they can feel comfortable in their schools and the bandwidth for learning is greater. So I really feel across the country, we have an opportunity here to increase supports. There's greater funding for this. And the president made it very clear that part of this funding should go toward increased access to social emotional learning and mental health supports for our students.
Support for students, certainly important. But what about school staff, Dr. Cardona? Again, when we think about all these disruptions and, a lot of shock in our state recently when you saw so many different schools being closed because of social media threats.
When you talk about staff, I think we must recognize that through this pandemic, it's not only our students that were affected, our staff were affected. Even just the changes in schedules and living conditions. We had different parents, teachers, and educators caring for their parents, for their children. Housing situations were different. People were working from home. There was a lot of dysregulation across the country, and we must recognize that we're all coming back together. And we have to care for our educators in order for them to care for our students. And we have to ensure that our buildings are not only physically safe, but emotionally safe, so that we can get to the business of teaching and learning and fostering those relationships that we know our students need to be successful.
You mentioned the federal infusion of all this money in communities that can help support initiatives and programs to support mental health. This is really telling when you see the U.S. Surgeon General just issuing a public health advisory on the mental health challenges. Dr. Cardona, symptoms of depression and anxiety doubled during the pandemic. And, again, we see these statistics also increasing rates of suicide, and it's just really troubling. And so can you talk about some specifics when we think about boosting mental health support? Like, what would that look like in a school district?
I visited a school in Michigan that had 3 campuses for their high schools. There were 6,000 students in this 3-campus high school. And each one of these 6,000 students had a change in their schedule, 8-period schedule, to have at least 1 period for social emotional learning or access to mental health if needed. So what they did was they structured it so all students, which means that they increased the number of staff members that are available to support students. New York City hired over 500 social workers to provide more support for students and staff. So these are tangible things that can be done with the American Rescue Plan funds. We also need to understand that in order to help our students, we have to make sure we're providing good professional learning opportunities for our teachers to help understand the signs of trauma, right? The signs of trauma could often be misinterpreted as discipline or behavioral issues. When a student has their head down, they may be thinking about some of the loss that they had. We must understand that we have to meet the students where they are. Many of them are experiencing trauma still with changes in their family structure, or many students had to move during the pandemic. So it's about building capacity in our districts to understand the signs of trauma, but also providing the staff support to give our students the help that they need, and creating structures in our schools that give students an opportunity to seek help if they need it, without stigma that is often associated with accessing mental health supports.
You mentioned teachers. I just wanted to pivot and talk about, nationwide, the percentage of teachers of color really lags behind what the general student population is. We know Connecticut has struggled to increase hiring teachers who are people of color, including male educators. I'm wondering what your response is to the work being done in Connecticut and what more can be done to help this.
Right. I'm really pleased that while in Connecticut, this was a priority, and the good work continues under the direction of Commissioner Charlene Russell Tucker and Dr. Shawana Tucker. There are specific programs that didn't exist 2-3 years ago aimed at diversifying the profession and making sure that all students could see themselves as teachers. It's really important that we tap into our greatest resource, Lucy, our students. We have students across the state and across the country that maybe are not looking at themselves as teachers. And we have to do a better job lifting the profession and celebrating the profession, honoring our educators by, number one, paying them a livable wage. It's unbelievable that in 2021, teachers have to work 2 to 3 jobs to make ends meet. But we really have to sell the profession as an opportunity to lift our country and really tap into pipeline programs for not only our students who could consider themselves teachers in the future, but also we have other folks in our buildings, paraeducators, climate specialists, who have a skill set that can lend itself to teaching. We have to make clearer and affordable pathways for them to continue their studies to become teachers. The funding is there now. There's urgency there. We really have to move the needle on this.
When we talk about public service, of course, I've got to ask you about student loan debt. There are many Americans who want to see the president use executive action power to forgive student loan debt widely. His approach so far has been targeted, such as forgiving more than $11 billion of debt, and including that's canceling billions in student loans under the expansion of the public service loan forgiveness program. I saw a tweet from you in mid-November saying, quote, "In case you missed it, in our first wave of the public service loan forgiveness changes, borrowers got $715 million in relief, and there is more to come." How so, Secretary?
That number's up to $12.5 billion. I'm really, really proud of that work. There hasn't been a president in our history that's done more for loan forgiveness for those who either were taken advantage of by their institution or the loan servicer, or those who have really fallen on hard times and need a little bit of support to get back on their feet. $12.5 billion since March. With the public service loan forgiveness, the intent there was if you serve the public for 10 years and you're paying your loans should be forgiven. Yet when I came into this office, 98% of the requests for that were denied. That's unacceptable. We have teachers, nurses who've dedicated their careers to serving the public. They should be entitled to that public service loan forgiveness. And I'm really proud of the work we've done. As you mentioned, we sent out emails. I think over 500,000 people have received emails that they're closer to their loans being forgiven. 30,000 people have received emails in the last 2 months saying your loans are no longer in existence because you served the public. That's the intention here. So when we talk about getting more teachers, we have to do more like this to make sure that we're honoring the intent of Congress in 2007 to provide public service loan forgiveness. I'm really proud of that. The conversations about general broad loan forgiveness continue, but I don't want to overlook the work that's been done under President Biden to really target and make sure we're providing support to those who should get it. And I also want to share, Lucy, that we're working extremely hard here to fix broken systems so that in 5 years from now, we're not in the same position where we have people that are in debt so much that they cannot buy a home, they can't grow their family. So we're fixing the root of the problem, but we're also looking at ways to provide loan forgiveness where possible.
So as Education Secretary, how do you build on that $12 billion of student debt that's been forgiven so far? Senator Warren and others believe that your department, the Education Department, can use its settlement and compromise powers to forgive student loans widely. What's your take on that?
Right. And, as I said earlier, those conversations are continuing. And you're never going to get a universal agreement across the country on that. But we're going to make sure that we're doing everything we can to provide not only support for our borrowers, but change the system so that all students, including those students right now who are in elementary school, to make sure that they have access to college that's affordable, college that can lead to a good paying job. And what we're doing, we're not wasting time on that. We're taking American Rescue Plan funds, but also funds in the framework of Build Back Better, which I'm very hopeful will get passed soon, to really rethink career and technical education and provide better pathways for our students in high school and community college to get to some of these jobs that we know are going to be available with the infrastructure plan passage. High-paying, high-skilled jobs for Americans to help lift families, but also lift our community.
A last question for you, Secretary Cardona. Connecticut is seeing a surge in COVID cases. Recently, there's a school district in Killingly, I believe, that voted to not have vaccination clinics on school property. I'm wondering if you can respond to that in this moment that we're in again, because as you know, when students are not in school, it really impacts them. And when we think about infections rising, what that means for switching back to hybrid, if things get worse.
Let me be very clear, Lucy. I was there for those conversations in Connecticut. I talked to the governor daily. I talked to superintendents daily. I talked to parents daily. We're not going to go back to where we were. I expect schools to be open in person for our children in a manner that's safe. And we need to do everything we can to use the tools that we have that we didn't have before. We have access to free vaccinations for students ages 5 and up, boosters for children 16 and up. We know how to keep our children safe. We know how to keep our community safe. It's really important that we don't take our foot off the gas, because we don't want to go back to hybrid learning. That should be in our rearview mirror. We shouldn't go back to that. We have the tools, we have the knowledge. I do encourage vaccination clinics in schools. I mean, I've been to Maryland, I've been to other states where they're doing it in a way that's really positive. It's keeping the community safe. We know. And in Connecticut, I think that's a great example. If there's high community spread, it's more likely to come into our schools. Let's keep our community spread down. We're all in this together. We learned that, Lucy. We're all in this together. We were able to make some progress in Connecticut, and I want to see Connecticut continue to lead the nation in efforts to keep spread low, keep our schools open, and keep our students succeeding.
Dr. Miguel Cardona, again, is the U.S. Education Secretary, former Education Commissioner here in our state. A pleasure to hear from you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Lucy.
I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Where We Live each day brings you conversations about issues that matter to you, and we hear from Connecticut residents.